He hurled an insult at a uniformed woman, utterly unthinking. By dawn, a searing headline had obliterated his conceit, leaving him awash in profound remorse he couldn't escape. Houston's George Bush Intercontinental Airport was a thronging labyrinth, each concourse pulsating with travelers journeying homeward, to work or beyond. Gate E14 mirrored this scene. The late evening Charlotte flight was boarding, but a minor technical hitch kept passengers milling, shifting, clutching their coffees and carry-ons. Trevor Aldridge, impatiently tapping his Rolex in the priority queue, exuded crispness in his suit jacket, his shoes gleaming under the fluorescent glow. He glanced at his phone for the third time in 5 minutes, exhaling dramatically. A missed client call blinked on his screen, but he dismissed it. His sole focus was reaching Charlotte for his morning meeting. The gate agent's voice crackled. "We'll commence general boarding shortly, thank you for your patience." Trevor muttered, "Yes, some of us have obligations." Just as the line began its slow advance, a tall woman in military fatigues approached, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Staff Sergeant Renata Colby. Renata appeared travel-weary yet composed, her posture impeccable, boots scuffed but pristine. A few instinctively parted, offering silent respect as they noted her uniform. Trevor, however, rolled his eyes as she passed, adjusting her bag strap. "Priority boarding," he stated, loud enough for her and others to overhear, "is for paying customers." The words hung, acrid and heavy. A nearby woman gripped her purse tighter. A man in a baseball cap shuffled uneasily. No one spoke. Renata paused for a mere fraction of a second, enough to fully absorb the comment. Her jaw subtly clenched, but she didn't turn. She simply continued, scanning her boarding pass, moving down the jet bridge. Trevor smirked, pleased with his remark. He turned to the man behind him, anticipating affirmation, but the man averted his gaze, feigning interest in the flight screen. Boarding resumed in a strained silence. As Trevor stepped onto the plane, he saw Renata a few rows ahead, efficiently stowing her bag in the overhead bin. She slid into her middle seat, face expressionless, hands folded in her lap, avoiding eye contact. Trevor found his first-class window seat several rows back. He slumped down with a grunt, loosening his tie. To him, this was merely another travel nuisance, another anecdote for future laughs at the bar with colleagues. Yet the reactions of others, the shift in the line's atmosphere, left a subtle unease at the back of his mind. So he dismissed it. He had greater concerns. The flight attendants concluded their safety briefing. The plane finally dislodged from the gate, engines rumbling to life as it taxied. Trevor glanced forward again. Renata was gazing out the window, her expression unreadable. It meant nothing to him. People were excessively sensitive these days, he thought. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the plane's vibrations coax him into a light, restless slumber as they ascended into the dark Texas sky. But Trevor had no inkling that a single headline would, by morning, irrevocably shatter his world. The seatbelt sign extinguished with a soft chime, and passengers immediately reached for headphones, laptops, and snacks, eager to escape the flight's confined reality. But not everyone forgot. A few rows behind Renata, an elderly woman with silver hair repeatedly glanced up from her crossword, stealing quick looks at the soldier. She fiddled with her pen more than seemed necessary. A young man in a faded Red Sox hoodie across the aisle leaned his head back but kept his eyes open, almost as if deliberating whether he should have intervened earlier. The cabin air felt heavier than a routine flight warranted. It wasn't loud, in fact it was almost too quiet. Sparse conversations, the hum of vents, the occasional rattle of an attendant's cart. Yet the tension from Trevor's comment clung to the atmosphere like pre-storm humidity. Renata sat silently. She didn't retrieve a book or scroll through her phone. She simply sat, hands folded neatly, staring into space. Internally, though, her thoughts raced. She'd spent 15 years serving a nation where such moments remained far too common. She'd borne wounded soldiers through mortar fire, sat by bedsides of young recruits who didn't survive, and written letters to families she could never truly console. Yet here she was, in uniform, subjected to dismissive scrutiny from a man who believed he could gauge her worth with a single phrase. Renata blinked slowly, willing herself not to let it sting. She wouldn't create a scene, wouldn't stoop to pettiness. She had endured too much for that. The woman with the crossword finally tore a piece of paper from her puzzle book and scribbled something. Minutes later, en route to the restroom, she casually dropped it onto Renata's tray table without a word. Renata glanced down. In messy handwriting it simply read, "Thank you for your service." A tightness, unrelated to anger, formed in her chest. She tucked the note into her pocket without looking around. She wanted no pity, no attention. Only silent, simple, genuine respect. Meanwhile, Trevor popped open a club soda and scrolled through emails on his tablet. A faint smirk still played on his lips. In his world, first impressions were forged by business cards, luxury watches, and LinkedIn connections, not scuffed boots and military insignia. As the cabin lights dimmed, Trevor adjusted his seat, put his tablet aside, and relaxed. The flight was unremarkable for him, just another entry on his calendar. He didn't notice the hushed conversations around Renata, nor the sideways glances directed his way by those who had heard him earlier. He failed to grasp that silence sometimes signifies not ignorance, but profound disappointment. The plane glided smoothly through the dark, star-flecked sky, charting a silver line across the southern states. Below, tiny towns blinked with sleepy lights, oblivious to the quiet, small battles unfolding thousands of feet above. Renata finally leaned back and closed her eyes, willing herself to let it go. More important things awaited her. Loved ones, a life she cherished. This flight, this moment would not define her. But in the back of her mind, she wondered how many more times she would have to endure these subtle wounds, these sharp words hurled like stones at her dignity. What Renata didn't know was that life had its own way of revealing truth, sometimes sooner than anyone anticipated. The plane's wheels softly screeched upon touching down at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. It was nearly midnight and most passengers were half asleep, heads bobbing with each landing bump. Trevor Aldridge stretched his arms, popped his neck, and checked his watch. 12 minutes early, not bad. He snatched his briefcase from under the seat and stood the instant the seatbelt sign extinguished, eager for his hotel bed. Around him, people slowly funneled into the narrow aisle, some polite, gesturing others forward. Others, like Trevor, pushed impatiently to be first through the bottleneck. He barely spared a glance at the uniformed woman still seated a few rows ahead, awaiting her turn. Renata remained seated, hands resting quietly on her knees. She wasn't rushed. The world had taught her long ago that sometimes it's best to let the storm pass before moving. She caught a few more glances from passengers. Not pitying, not curious, just aware. She preferred it that way. Awareness at least was a start. Trevor finally reached the exit, offering the tired flight attendant a quick, distracted thanks before striding briskly into the jet bridge. The terminal's heavy, warm air hit him like a wall. He hiked his bag higher and made a beeline for baggage claim. A car service awaited him. He didn't think of Renata again as he powered through the terminal, weaving past slower travelers, dragging his rolling suitcase. For Trevor, the night was merely beginning. Emails to answer, a client dinner to confirm, a morning packed with meetings. He saw the soldier certainly, but in his mind she was just another face on another flight, soon forgotten by his second whiskey at the hotel bar. Outside, a thick layer of humidity enveloped the air. Trevor climbed into the black town car waiting curbside, barely acknowledging the driver before burying himself in his phone again. "Marriott Uptown," he stated without looking up. The driver nodded, pulling into traffic, city lights blurring past the windows. Meanwhile, inside the terminal, Renata sat on a metal bench near baggage claim, awaiting her single well-worn duffel bag on the carousel. She didn't mind the wait. She pulled out the crumpled note, smoothing the paper flat against her palm. "Thank you for your service." Simple words, but when spoken sincerely or written by a stranger who noticed, they meant more than 1,000 apologies ever could. Her bag finally emerged. She grabbed it with one hand and headed for the exit, boots clicking softly on the polished floor. No fancy car service awaited her, no plush hotel room. Just a 2-hour drive to her modest rental outside Hickory, North Carolina, where her dog and a comfortable recliner awaited. The contrast between Trevor's night and Renata's couldn't have been starker. One navigated life assuming the world owed him something. The other had given pieces of herself for years without ever asking for anything in return. But neither knew that by the next sunrise, the wall between their worlds would collapse. Because fate and a single news story had a way of ensuring that when you finally see someone clearly, It's already too late to feign ignorance. And the truth, when it struck Trevor, wouldn't be gentle. It would land like a punch to the heart. The next morning dawned without fanfare, a weak sun battling the heavy Carolina clouds as commuters streamed onto Concord's streets, just outside Charlotte. Trevor Aldridge sat alone at a corner table in a quaint cafe called Milltown Brew, nestled between a pharmacy and a vintage furniture store. He wasn't one to linger over breakfast, but today he had time before his meetings began. He sipped black coffee, scrolled absently through emails, barely registering the low murmur of other patrons. Deals, deadlines, dinner reservations, his mind darted from one task to another, never truly settling. Until a notification popped up on his newsfeed. At first he disregarded it. Another political headline, another celebrity scandal, nothing new. But as he took another absent-minded sip, a name caught his eye. Local soldier honored for heroism in attack overseas. Below the headline was a photo. Trevor's hand froze mid-air. It was her. Unmistakably. The same steely gaze, the same impeccably pressed uniform from last night's flight. Staff Sergeant Renata Colby. He clicked the article, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the cafe's background music. Staff Sergeant Renata Colby, a decorated combat medic with over 15 years of service, was recognized yesterday for her extraordinary bravery during a surprise mortar attack on a U.S. base in Eastern Europe. Despite heavy fire, Colby rescued 12 soldiers, administering life-saving aid and personally carrying 3 wounded men to safety under relentless assault. The words blurred slightly as Trevor stared at the screen. She had saved lives, risked everything, faced bullets and bombs, while he had complained about flight delays and flung cheap insults at an airport gate. He scrolled further. A quote from her commanding officer, "She's the reason some of our guys made it home." He didn't hesitate. That's who she is. Trevor slowly set his phone down, hands trembling slightly. He couldn't recall the last time his chest felt so constricted. The cafe's ambient chatter faded into a distant hum. He recalled the previous night, her calm face, her silent patience, how he had utterly overlooked her, how he had assumed without asking, spoken without thinking. The memory of his own voice, smug, dismissive, replayed in his mind like a cruel jest. Priority boardings for paying customers. He felt ill. Trevor pushed his coffee aside, appetite gone, pride gone. A sudden crushing wave of shame washed over him, and for the first time in a long time he had no defense, no excuse sharp enough to pierce the glaring truth. He buried his face in his hands for a moment. It didn't matter that he was in public in a fine suit at a polished table. He felt small, smaller than he had ever felt. It wasn't just the insult, not just the ignorance. It was the realization that he had become the kind of person he once swore he'd never be. Someone who measured worth by status, appearances, and baseless assumptions. Trevor squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he could rewind time, wishing he could seize himself by the shoulders at that gate and instill some decency back into his bones. But wishing changed nothing. He picked up his phone again, scrolling back to Renata's picture. The faintest smile ghosted across her face in the photo, not for the camera, but a smile suggesting a deeper strength, faith, grace. And he had disrespected that. The weight of it settled deeply, unmoving in his chest. But guilt alone wasn't enough to undo the harm. If Trevor wanted to be better, he had to confront what he had become, however uncomfortable it made him. Trevor remained motionless in that corner booth for what felt like an hour, his fingers curling and uncurling around his coffee cup, which had long since gone cold. A few people came and went at nearby tables, but he barely noticed. The truth had struck him too profoundly. He stared down at the phone again, reading every line of the article, every word about Renata's courage, somehow hoping it would lessen the sting in his chest. But it didn't. It only intensified it. He thought back to his own life. His carefully constructed world of boardrooms, quarterly earnings, golf trips, cocktail receptions. He had spent years convincing himself that success meant he had nothing left to learn from anyone. He had built walls, neat and tall, around his comfortable kingdom, and then with one casual insult and one news story, the walls cracked open. He pushed his chair back, letting it scrape loudly against the hardwood floor. Heads turned, but he didn't care. He needed air, space, something to explain how he could feel so hollow so swiftly. Outside, morning traffic hummed along the main street. Trevor stood under the cafe's awning, running a hand down his face. The weight in his chest didn't lift. He thought about Renata sitting there on the plane, quiet, still, absorbing his words like another undeserved blow. He imagined how many times in her life she had been forced to swallow disrespect and continue on, because showing anger would only fuel more ignorance. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And for once, Trevor wasn't going to lie to himself about it. He paced the sidewalk for a moment, then pulled his phone back out. His fingers hovered. He searched her name, Staff Sergeant Renata Colby. Pages of articles flooded the screen. News outlets from Raleigh, Greensboro, even national coverage. Her story was everywhere. Her bravery, her selflessness, her refusal to leave anyone behind. Trevor's stomach twisted again. He wanted to say something, to apologize, but what? Sorry I treated you like less than a person before I knew you were a hero? The cowardice of the thought made his face burn. He realized bitterly that he wanted forgiveness for his own comfort, not because he deserved it. He sank onto a bench outside the cafe, the morning breeze caressing the back of his neck. His mind incessantly replayed the gate scene. Her standing there, her bag over one shoulder, the ugly words spilling from his mouth as if they meant nothing. But they weren't nothing. They were a crack in the foundation of who he believed himself to be. Trevor clenched his hands into fists, then slowly released them. For years he had drifted through life believing himself a good man because he followed rules, paid taxes, shook hands at charity events. But true character wasn't measured by grand gestures performed for an audience. It was measured by small, unnoticed moments, where no one was keeping score. And he had failed miserably. But recognizing the truth was only the first step. What Trevor chose to do next would determine whether he remained the man he had just seen clearly for the first time, or became someone better. Trevor sat hunched on the weathered bench, the sounds of morning life continuing around him. Car horns, distant barking dogs, people ordering breakfast from food trucks across the street. It all felt strangely remote, as if he were observing the world through an unopenable window. He opened his phone again, searching for anything. An email, a social media page, a way to reach Renata Colby. He knew it was a long shot. Someone who had lived through what she had probably wasn't posting weekend selfies or LinkedIn updates. So he tried. Nothing personal appeared, only news articles, a few military press releases, and one grainy video clip from a local ceremony where her commander pinned another medal to her chest. Trevor sat back, defeated. He realized then that sometimes you don't get the chance to apologize. Sometimes when you wound someone, they walk out of your life without ever looking back, and you're left with the weight of it, forced to carry it alone. It wasn't about him fixing his guilt. It was about recognizing the hole he had dug and learning to climb out without expecting someone else to pull him up. He considered writing a letter, perhaps contacting her base and sending something. But what would he even say? I'm sorry I disrespected you before I knew you were important? It sounded hollow even in his own head. Trevor stood up, shoving his phone into his pocket. He crossed the street and started walking, not caring where, past brick storefronts, a barber shop just opening, a church with a crooked sign reading, "Character is what you do when nobody is watching." He stopped cold. The message struck him harder than anything he'd read that morning. Character isn't about apologies when you're caught. It's about who you are when no one's applauding, when there's no headline, no camera, no pat on the back. That was where he had erred, not just at the airport but in hundreds of moments before. He had grown accustomed to judging people by titles, salaries, appearances. If someone didn't fit his narrow vision of success, he dismissed them without a second thought. Renata had exposed that flaw in him, simply by existing, by standing there in her worn boots and quiet strength. And the worst part was, he knew there were thousands more like her. People he had probably overlooked, dismissed, judged without knowing the first thing about their lives. Trevor continued walking, hands deep in his pockets. He knew he couldn't erase what he had said, couldn't retract the look she must have seen on his face, the sting of those words. But maybe he could start by never making that mistake again, by seeing people, truly seeing them instead of making lazy judgments at a glance. Maybe he couldn't find Renata Colby to apologize, but he could ensure the next Renata he met would only see respect in his eyes. That had to mean something. It wasn't a grand gesture, not enough to balance the scales, but it was a step, a real one. He pulled out his phone one last time before his meeting. He opened a blank note and typed a few words. Words he never wanted to forget. Speak less, listen more, assume nothing, respect always. Trevor locked the screen, took a deep breath and slipped the phone into his jacket. Today was just the beginning. The real work would take much longer. But somewhere, a small voice told him it wasn't too late to start becoming the man he should have been all along. The meeting room smelled faintly of fresh coffee and dry erase markers. Trevor sat through the first 15 minutes barely hearing a word. The client's voice droned on about numbers and projections, but Trevor's mind was elsewhere. It kept returning to the gate, to the plane, to the silent strength sitting just a few rows ahead. For the first time in a long time, Trevor wasn't thinking about contracts or closing deals. He was thinking about how easily we overlook those beside us, how quick we are to judge, how slow to understand. He looked around the room, suits and ties, neat haircuts, polished shoes. A week ago he would have only noted who seemed important, who mattered to his career. Today he noticed something different. Who looked tired, who seemed to carry a heavy burden, who remained silent and less addressed. Trevor adjusted his tie and sat a little straighter, not to impress but to pay attention, to be better. After the meeting he didn't rush out the door as usual. He lingered, shook a few hands, asked a couple of assistants about their mornings, not because he needed anything but because they deserved to be seen. It was a small beginning, a quiet one, but that was the point. The most significant changes don't arrive with fireworks. They come with the slow rebuilding of habits, the steady rewriting of who you are at your core. Trevor wasn't going to fix everything in a day. He wasn't going to erase every careless word he'd spoken over the years. But he could refuse to add new ones. And maybe, just maybe, the next time he crossed paths with someone like Staff Sergeant Renata Colby, he'd meet their eyes with nothing but genuine respect. No assumptions, no walls, no hesitation. The morning continued and life resumed its usual rhythm. But something within Trevor had irrevocably shifted. He knew now that true strength isn't loud or boastful. It doesn't always wear a badge or a medal. Sometimes, it sits quietly by the window on a late-night flight, bearing the weight of sacrifices no one else can see. And if you're fortunate enough to encounter that kind of strength, the very least you can do, the very least, is treat it with the dignity it deserves. As Trevor left the office building later that day, the sky had softened to blue. The city bustled around him, strangers moving in a dozen directions. He no longer saw a sea of faces. He saw individuals, stories, battles won and battles still being fought, all hidden beneath the surface. And he promised himself from that day forward, never again to mistake silence for weakness, nor a uniform for just another outfit, nor a stranger for someone unworthy of kindness. Some lessons come easily, some carve their way into you the hard way. But the ones that endure, the ones that truly change you, are those earned through humility, discomfort, and the willingness to confront your own reflection. And perhaps today is the perfect day for all of us to ask, how do we treat the people we don't know? Those we pass at the airport, the grocery store, on the sidewalk? Are we truly seeing them or just rushing past? If this story made you pause even for a moment, then perhaps you're ready to listen more, assume less, respect always. Thanks for being here. If you believe stories like these matter, subscribe for more. And don't forget, sometimes the biggest difference you can make in someone's life is simply treating them like they matter.